Hi there, Tiffin owners. Today in your 2013 Tiffin Allegro, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install Sumo springs on the rear axle. Now before we install our Sumo springs, we're going to take it out on our test course so we can get a baseline measurement on how our motorhome feels when going over various bumps and when performing evasive maneuvers. We're going to start by going over the uneven bump section on our test course, and this is going to simulate potholes and other uneven road surfaces that you'll encounter out there. And this is going to rock back and forth, and we are going to see pretty substantial improvements, I suspect, when we get the Sumo springs on, because they do really help out with sway back and forth as they work together. And we can feel the motorhome rocking here. It definitely, when you hit those bumps, you can feel the sway that we've got going here on the inside. And it is pretty substantial. We've got quite the rock going on right now. I can see the cameraman struggling to hold the camera on it. Next, we're going to go over our even bump section, and this is going to be the forward and aft movement. We are going to get some minor improvements here with our Sumo springs, as it is going to help minimize up and down bouncing motions that were going to occur, because it is going to work with our suspension and our shocks to help minimize all that movement. It's not so bad when going over these bumps. These would simulate pulling into your driveway or hitting a speed bump. And lastly, now we're going to head down to our slalom section, where we're going to get the motorhome going back and forth and perform some evasive maneuvers. Oh, you can feel a pretty good rock going when you start to turn here. It's not quite as bad as I had expected it to be, because it was very bad back and forth when we were going over our uneven bump section. But it definitely has some good rocking to it. I expect we're going to feel like we're going to have quite a bit more control once we get our Sumo springs on, as it's going to minimize how much force we're going to be feeling under those turns. Now with our Sumo springs installed, we're going to hit the test course once again. And just like before, we're going to start with our uneven bump section. And I expect there to be quite drastic improvements here, as we've got our Sumo springs helping to counteract that sway that we have. And there's already a very noticeable difference when we just hit the bump. You don't feel it quite as much. We do, of course, still have some sway, but it does feel like it has been reduced with our Sumo springs. And you can see it rocking back and forth here. But we're going to head into the straight section next, and this is going to be our forward and aft movement. And here you definitely feel a big difference when we're coming down. We don't have quite as much oscillation up and down once we come back down on the pavement here after going over our bump. And lastly, we're going to go back into that slalom section. And this is where you usually notice the improvements the most here, just because the stability when driving it feels quite a bit better. You just feel more in control, like you're driving the motorhome rather than the motorhome's driving you. And we're coming into the slalom section now, where we can perform some evasive maneuvers. Yeah, it's definitely got some rock into it like it had before, but it definitely feels quite a bit more stable than it did before. Adding Sumo springs to the front will also help assist our rear Sumo springs to further increase our anti-sway and comfort inside of our motorhome. You can pick up front Sumo springs here at etrailer.com, and so it's easy to get a set of both and have them done at the exact same time, whether you're doing it yourself or scheduling an appointment to get it done somewhere. And this is what our Sumo spring looks like when it's installed. It attaches to the frame as well as on top of our leaf spring stack to work with our suspension to provide additional load leveling support. Now, having Sumo springs installed doesn't increase the weight that you can carry in your motorhome. It just helps provide assistance for the weight that's already there, so that way it's not swaying and sagging down as much as it would before. Sumo springs are designed to compress up to 80%, providing dynamic support. So the further it's compressed, the more support it's going to give, because it wants to be in its normal resting position. Same works for when our suspension extends, like in a swaying motion. So if we're over here on the driver's side, and if it's swayed towards the passenger side, it would want to stretch this spring. The spring, again, wants to be in its normal position, so it's going to pull itself back down. And while this one's stretching, the other one's going to be compressing, and that one wants to return to its natural state as well. This is all going to reduce the amount of sway that you're going to have total, because it's going to help keep it upright. And it's overall just going to help smooth out your ride, because if you hit any potholes or poor terrain, the oscillations you have are going to be minimized with our spring, and it's also going to dampen some of that force going through our suspension, so we're not going to feel it as much inside the cab. So what this means for you is you're going to have less fatigue from driving your motorhome because you're not going to be working so hard to maintain control of it, and you're not going to be fighting those crosswinds as much as they're blowing across you. It's also going to be more comfortable for you and your passengers, so all of you are going to have more energy and be ready to go when you reach your destination. The spring is constructed of a multi-cellular urethane that is UV resistant as well as resistant against road grime and oils, so it's not going to break down. It's going to last a nice long time. This installation is going to take a little bit of muscle and a little bit of work to get installed. You are going to need some heavy-duty tools to complete this as well, but if you follow along with me and listen to our advice on which tools you'll need, we can go ahead and get this installed together. Alternatively, if you don't want to purchase all the heavy-duty equipment you're going to need to complete this installation, you can order your springs now and then schedule an appointment to have them installed by a professional. We'll begin our installation by removing our wheels, and you can do this by using your leveling jacks to lift up the vehicle. You may need to place some large blocks underneath your leveling jacks to get you the height you need to get the wheels off the ground. You'll also want to make sure you place a jack stand underneath the frame because we don't want to support our vehicle with just our leveling jacks and trusting that while we're working underneath of it. Once you've got it supported though, we can then just go ahead and take the wheels off. Depending on the trim package that you've selected, your hardware may be slightly different. The floor jack that I've got sitting under there we'll be using in a later step to adjust the height of our axle. Once you've got the cover removed, you'll want to remove the bolts down behind it. They're likely going to be a different size than what your cover was. We're using a 33 millimeter for ours, but again, depending on the trim package you have, they may be slightly different. If you don't have a large impact like this, many of these nuts are on extremely tight, so you may want to crack them loose before lifting it up, as our wheel's going to spin now, and that makes it very difficult to take them off by hand. So you might want to just get them a turn or two loose before you lift it up, so a weaker gun would be able to then take them off. Once you've got all of your lug nuts off of there, we can take our wheels off and set them aside. They are pretty heavy, so I'm just going to have to kind of work them until they pop off of there, and we're just going to roll it away. We now need to do some pre-assembly on our spring. So we've got the top facing up now, and you'll know it's the top because it'll have 4 holes in it. We're going to use the holes furthest apart, and we're just going to set our upper bracket on it like that, and the sides are going to drape down the side of our spring. We'll then secure it on top with the smaller hex head bolts that come in your kit. These are the shorter ones. Get them started, and we can go ahead and fully secure these using a 9/16 socket. We'll then flip it over, and on bottom we're going to loosely secure our lower bracket. We want this portion to be on our spring where the hole is there, and the square sides here are going to face away from the spring. We want it to be loose though, so we can easily choose our orientation. So what I like to do is run it all the way down first just to clean up the threads because there's some paint on there, and then back it up enough to where we can easily still rotate our lower bracket like this. We'll now need to take our spring and we're going to set it on top of our leaf spring stack just in front of the axle, and the little hook that is located here on our lower bracket, we want that to hook on the U-bolt. So that's hooked on the inside of that U-bolt, so we're pulling it as far away from there as we can because that hook's going to butt up against that, and the other part of our lower bracket on the opposite side is going to drape down on each side of our lower spring. Now we do need to have our carriage bolts down through there so we can attach them. In a lot of cases when you go to slide these down, it is going to want to hit on the spring there a little bit, so you may have to just kind of tilt it a little bit in order to get that bolt to pass down through. Same thing with the one that's going to go on the other side here. Once you've got your carriage bolts fed down and ensure your bracket's in the correct position, we can take the lower clamp, and it's just going to slide right onto those carriage bolts that we had dropped down. Once you've got your bracket slid on there, we do want the L shapes to be pointed down towards the ground, and we're then going to secure this on here with locking nuts. Once you've got both of them started, we can go ahead and tighten those down. Just double check the position of your lower bracket, making sure that it's sitting properly on that spring, and then we'll tighten it down using a 9/16 socket. When tightening these down, you do want to kind of go back and forth to make sure you're tightening them down even. So I'm going to run this one up till it just about touches. Now we need to measure the length of our frame. And it's about 9 inches top to bottom our frame is, because we want our lower hole to be positioned right in the middle of the frame. So we're going to mark our frame now right at about 4.5 inches. Because that's going to be the middle. And I like to just make my mark right here next to the spring, right at 4.5. We're then going to do the same thing just over here on the other side, marking it at 4.5. Double check ourselves, make sure that looks good. Now the jack that we had sitting under there, we're going to position it underneath the axle over here on this side. And we're going to jack up the axle until those lower holes line up with those marks that we made. And that's pretty close right there. So now that we've got it lined up with our marks, we're going to drill out our lower holes in that position, and then we can secure it, and we'll do the other holes. So now we're going to drill out this lower hole using a 3/8 drill bit. One of the things I did notice is your instructions tells you to use a 7/16 drill bit, but that's way too large because it tells you to use your upper bracket here as a template, and the hole in your bracket here is only a 3/8 drill bit. So you'd have to drill a very large hole to use the one indicated in the instructions. You also want to just take a quick gander on the opposite side. I just usually use my hand and feel around to make sure there's no components there, and then we're going to drill out since there's nothing on that other side. Now that we've got this one drilled out, we're going to take the longer hex head bolts, we're going to push it through our bracket in the frame, and on the opposite side we're just going to secure it with a locking nut. We're just going to leave it loose for now, because once we've got it secured here, just so that way it's going to stay in there and ensure that this hole is going to stay lined up for us. We then will need to jack up just a little bit more, because most of the time this rear one lines up first, and then you got to just give it another couple of pumps to this side to get this side to line up. Then we're going to drill out this hole and insert a bolt in it just like we did over here. It's going to be kind of hard to see because to get the pressure I need to get through the frame, I'm going to have to get quite up in here. Now that we've got both of the lower holes drilled out and our hardware inserted, we can go ahead and tighten these down with a 9/16 socket and wrench. Now that these are tight, we can easily use the rest of our holes as a template here. We'll want to use the top set of holes on each side if possible. You just want to check to make sure there's nothing on the other side of the frame. If there is something on the other side of the frame here, there is another hole just below it that you can use if it is necessary. But if you have the option, definitely use the top hole here. So we're just going to drill it out and then secure our hardware just like we did the lower holes. And you're only going to have a total of 4 bolts, so just choose one on each side for the top ones here. With our top ones drilled out, we can install the bolts the same way, and then we want to go back and tighten them all down. Now that this side's completed, we can perform the exact same procedures over on the other side. And once you've got both sides done, we can now reinstall our wheels. You want to make sure that you torque those down to the manufacturer's specifications. In a lot of instances, you'll find a torque spec written on the head of the nut. You can see here that the torque on our nut's 450 to 500 foot-pounds, and this is an extremely high amount of torque that you likely don't have a torque wrench high enough for. So I recommend that you purchase a torque wrench that can go this high before performing this job, or you work out something with your local repair shops, as many of the larger truck repair shops do service calls so they can come out and torque your wheels if you pay a small fee. With everything tightened and torqued, we're ready to hit the road. And that completes our installation of Sumo springs on the rear axle for our 2013 Tiffin Allegro.